We want to now turn from the pre-Civil War movement, in which Phoebe Palmer was so prominent, and together with a lot of other Methodists, she was just the one that kind of kept it going. All kinds of ministers and bishops and everybody else were involved in it, because Methodism at this point is still strongly committed essentially to the doctrine of holiness and looks upon itself as a holiness church. People outside didn't look on it as a holiness church necessarily. When Hannah Whitehall Smith, whom I'll talk to you a good bit about a little later on, when she told her sister that she ought to get this experience, she said this. It's a classic quote that I like to give. She said, Sarah, her sister's name was Sarah, she called her Sally sometimes. She said, Sally, if you want to get this experience, you're going to have to go to the Methodist trough. Now, in those days, a trough was put in the hog pen. If you want this experience, you're going to have to go to the Methodist trough. Now, that was a wealthy Philadelphia Quaker woman, and in those days, the Quakers were the rulers of Philadelphia. That's the way she looked on the Methodists. She loved them, she wanted them, and she thought that they were really pretty crude people. And so this is the pre-Civil War movement. Now, during the war, as someone has said, as that brought up, during the war, revival continued in the armies. There was strong support by certain generals for revival movements, but the national spiritual condition naturally didn't do much during the Civil War in the wartime period. And so it was after the war that we begin to get a new second stage in this holiness revival. Phoebe Palmer was the conversational stage. It was good because it was easy for people who were not Methodists to come in and sit down like you would in somebody's parlor and talk. It was conversational, therefore it wasn't polemical. And by polemical we mean it wasn't trying to define fine points and it wasn't arguing back and forth. It was mainly testimony, reading God's Word about holiness and the holy life, and especially testimony, saying what God had done so that you could be encouraged to keep after it and to find Christian perfection. And all the time, very much in a Methodist way, except that the main method of approaching people was put it all on the altar, consecrate everything, believe, and that is the witness that God is yours because you take it by faith. Here is the beginnings of name it, claim it theology. Now, I'm not saying that Phoebe Palmer is responsible for that, but her way of saying it opened up a pattern which, when it was pushed a little further, became name it, claim it. If you see it in the Bible and you believe it, name it, you have it. Now, we can't go on to the fine details of that, but there is something in that if it's pushed that far is not quite right. And you know what it is? It's the same thing I talked to you about when Wesley said, I will not say that a man cannot be saved if he will. But I will not say that a man can be saved when he will. Remember that from earlier in the day? So, Phoebe Palmer would say, if it's in the Bible, and she was convinced it was there, and so did many other people, if you believe you can be made holy, if you believe you can be sanctified holy, which was the term used commonly by the Methodists in that day, if you believe it, you see it, you claim it, and it's done, because God's true to His Word. But if it's pushed to the point where you say you don't have any further witness or anything needed, then you get into problems, because we accept it in the condition in which we know ourselves, but we don't always know what God is doing and how He is doing it, and the result is that God may still want us to take another step of some kind in our personal relationship with Him before we can be clear and fully know that we have satisfied what He wants us to do. And I can't explain it better than that except to say there is some fine point there, which is why some people have opposed the doctrine in this way. They say, that's not Wesleyan. The problem with saying it's not Wesleyan is this. I don't have time to get the quote. I've got it here in my materials. Wesley said almost exactly the same thing in his own context. He said, if this is God's promise, then it is true, and if it's His promise, He has made the way to receive it. If God promises it, then He will give it to us. In other words, God's promises are God's fulfillment by faith. And he said, then you should always be seeking it, and you should be seeking it by faith now, because it may come at any meeting, at any moment, at any time. Now, that's almost exactly what Phoebe Palmer was saying, but they were in two different contexts. The one context was American revivalism, which was what? Be saved tonight, come up to the altar, say the sinner's prayer, and you're saved. Phoebe Palmer said, you want to be sanctified, God promises it, just like He does that we be saved. We don't have to know a lot about it, we just have to know we need it. We come to the promise, God fulfills it. So we come to the four spiritual laws. See? Do you see it? Do you believe it? Accept it? That's it. Now, that's being flippant. But part of the problem of the four spiritual laws is that it's been taken as what? A formula. And so first blessing, second blessing, satisfaction, you see. It's a formula. But actually, it's not a formula. It's a promise of God. It's a way that God has set up for us. But it's got to be done in interactive relationship with God. And it may come just as quickly as the moment, because when God decides to do it and we decide it should be done by faith, it's done. God does what He says He's promised to do. But there's a bit of presumption if we just say, I can kind of do it anytime I want. Remember Wesley said, God always will do it, but not always when we decide it's to be done. And right in there somewhere hangs a problem in the movement with Phoebe Palmer, which has been argued up and down. All I can say is that the whole movement basically grew on Palmer's theology. And we are in existence because she gave a way, like the four spiritual laws does for conversion. She gave a way by which people could see through this mass of confusion about what Christian perfection was. And she said, it's by faith. That's what Wesley says. Wesley says, if it's by faith, then it can be now. And this cuts into the shorter way, which we started out with. Then it can be now. And so, how do I get sanctified? I don't do it by praying more. I don't do it by giving more to the church. I don't do it by even being better, by being good. Because I can't outside of the will of God. I do it by believing that Christ wants to make my heart pure and that He will do it when I believe. And by the way, I just noticed I made a mistake. Someone reminded me of it. On the consecration hymn, Take My Life, it's Francis Ridley Havergal, not Fanny Crosby in that case. Fanny Crosby was a great holiness hymn writer, but Francis Ridley Havergal was a great Episcopalian holiness person who wrote some of the great songs of the church and definitely believed in a Wesleyan understanding of holiness, although she was an Episcopalian or an Anglican I should say. Well, now that correction's in the tape, we'll go ahead. After the war, Phoebe Palmer came back from England, but her work was essentially done. Not that she quit, but she just was at a place where she was getting the age that she no longer was actively working in the movement. And a new surge of revival grew, and this is now really in the heart of Methodism. A group of people who were converted under Palmer's ministry influenced other people constantly in American camp meetings. And one day, a preacher's wife from New York by the name of Martha Inskip, I-N-S-K-I-P, is the name. This is the next prominent name to Palmer in our history. Martha, and her husband's name was John Inskip. He was pastor of one of the larger New York churches of Methodism. And New York was the center of Methodism at this time, the Holy City, as we tend to say in denominations, along with Marion and Wilmore and all those holy cities. And now Indianapolis. So she went up to a Methodist. She was a Methodist, the Inskips were. He was a Methodist preacher. He had written a book called Methodism Explained, in which he had kind of been critical of the Phoebe Palmer revival. And one of the common criticisms was, and you always meet this when you talk about holiness, and it can't be avoided, and it's a very legitimate question. If people are holy, why do they act like they do? If your heart's perfect, why are you so imperfect? Well, there may be many reasons for that, but never forget that at the ultimate end of that, nobody is ever perfect in life. Nobody perfectly expresses the holiness of God through our hearts, through our lives, which He gives us when we are sanctified holy. Now, that is not given as an excuse. That's given as a reality. We are fallen creatures. That's where we are in the human flesh. But it is not something which keeps us from loving God. And it doesn't keep us from loving our fellow men and women. But it doesn't mean that we have the knowledge or the psychological ability or the social skills or whatever you want to call it, the psychological makeup, we're all different, to get along with everybody. And aren't you so glad that Paul, who certainly believed in this doctrine, said that we're to get along with everybody in as much as it is possible? I'm glad for that loophole. But that's the Bible. That's the proof text. In other words, and he was a good illustration of it, because he didn't take a certain young man along on a missionary trip because he was put out that he hadn't done what he should have on the previous one. You see. So what we are talking about is not absolute perfection. Wesley was very clear to make that. At any rate, the result is that Inskip was using that kind of excuse against the movement. And another one is that when you testify about it, you're proud. And this could very well be. You know, we can be proud in anything we do if we have a proud heart in any way. But that was the most common attack made on Phoebe Palmer people. When somebody got up and said, I believe I love the Lord with my whole heart, and I've been enjoying this relationship for 15 years, they said, oh, he hasn't sinned in 15 years. See? I'm just giving these to you because these are the common things which you'll see again and again and again. I read them in the books all the time when I read books on the other side from other people outside of the movement or within Methodism as we argue these points. But I think the best answer to that is, and it's come up recently several times to me, let's turn it around a bit. Suppose you really believe, as I do and as many others do, that God can make us perfect in heart in the sense that we can love Him with our whole heart. That the promise, the command is the promise. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. And suppose we believe that He has set up that kind of relationship with us and that He has given us the grace to in some measure fill it and appreciate it. What if you don't testify about it? You're denying the grace of God. Now that has come up several times to me recently when in response to this. I had never come upon it earlier. But it's something you have to think about. Would you hesitate to say the Lord has saved me? No. There's not an evangelical around that would hesitate to say that. In fact, you've got to say it if you want to get into church. It's a confession everybody requires. Then why, if God gives us by faith an experience that He wants to give us as part of that process, why do we not have the right to say so? It's not us doing it. Now you see why people say that? Because they still think that holiness is something we do. And that we can probably never get rid of. But if you understand what God says when He says, I want to sanctify you holy, not to make you perfect so that everybody will love you and think you're the greatest guy around, but that you will love God and love them even if they don't love you. Amen. That's it. And if you believe God has done that for you, then praise Him. Amen. And praise Him for the grace that is able to do that. But it's so hard to do because the whole idea of sanctification is so different in a non-Wesleyan context that people think you do it because you're good. You pray more, you go to church more, you treat people more nicely and more beautifully and so forth, and all of that sanctifies you. All of that is part of a maturing, sanctified life, but it's not what makes us holy. Those are the things that come after we give our all to God. I was riding in a car, I remember so distinctly, through Springfield, Missouri one time when I was meeting with some Pentecostal theologians and others at a meeting out in Springfield, a theological society meeting. And one of the men who wrote with me in the 5 Views on Sanctification, which, by the way, is available from Zondervan in their Counterpoint series, it's a theological series, in which I write the Wesleyan article and then 4 other men write the different views of sanctification, and we interact with each other. Keith has seen it, I'm sure. In there, this man wrote the one on Pentecostal outlook on holiness out of the Assemblies of God. And he said to me, this is 30 years ago, he said, how can you in one moment say that you give everything to God in the future as well as in the present. This is lay the whole package on the altar, which is common in our. He said, and he knew all about it. He said, how can you say that when you don't know what's going to happen? You say, I've given God everything for now and whatever comes in the future. And I think the Lord inspired me to give a reasonable answer. I said, well, I married my wife at that time, maybe 20 years before. And I said, when I married Hallie, I promised her that I would be true to her and to no one else, and that I would love her forever more than I loved anybody else. I said, I made vows, and I said, all throughout life, whenever I came to a point where that was challenged in any way in my relationship with people, that was done. That had been decided long ago. Now, not that you can do it automatically, because there are many ways in which Satan tries to deceive all of us in one way or another in our relationship with people. Not that it was done, but I had the anchor point. I had made a commitment. And when anything came up which was contrary to that, which in any way would lead me to something else, no, I settled that. See, I settled that. Now, I think we can do the same thing with the Lord in even a more real way. We don't know what's going to come up. We don't know what difficulties are going to challenge the fact that we've given God everything. And it'll come up again and again and again. But there's a point where you settle it. I was reading a book of Catholic prayers by Karl Rahner, who's a Catholic theologian, and it comes out in so many different ways. He said there is an intensity in prayer that you can go through on a single point, that eventually you feel like you've broken through to God. We used to call it praying through. And the Catholic said, you're broken through to God. And he said, from that moment on, life is different. Everything is lived in the light of that moment. Now, dear friends, I'm not trying to make sanctification a spectacular thing, because sometimes people accept this in a quiet way and they go on with their Christian life and they live in the light. And other times it's a very dramatic event. John Inskip, when he got it, he just felt like waves of liquid glory were flowing over him. And he became a very dynamic preacher of the movement. But it wasn't the waves of liquid glory. It was the simple fact that you had come to a moment when you and God got together and made a covenant, if you will, under God's promises. And the result is that from then you live life in the light of that. And so whenever anything comes up which says, is this yours or is it God's, or is this your will or God's will? You don't know immediately. You may not be able to give answers to it, but you know one thing, that when it comes out, you're going to be on God's side. Amen. I'm starting to preach now. But I want you to see the dynamic of this experience. And what I believe the Bible bases, without claiming too much. Wesley said, don't make it too high, because it doesn't make us perfect in our actions. It matures us. And hopefully we're going to be better persons and better Christians than we will be if someone lives in constant love with God and God keeps talking to you. He'll certainly straighten out a lot of things in your everyday life. I don't mean sins, I mean in the way you deal with people, the way he'll constantly keep that if you're open. But the simple fact is, it's that I have a relationship with God, and that is where it starts. And if we don't have that, we can't do it. And here's where we get the Old Testament scriptures, which Wesley often used from Ezekiel. I will give them a new heart. I will take out the heart of stone, and I will give them a heart of flesh. To love me. Why? To love me and what? Keep my commandments. I heard a preacher, and I won't name his denomination because that wouldn't be necessarily useful, but I heard a preacher one time say, now I tell my people, don't follow me. I'm a poor example of what it means to be a Christian. I get mixed up all the time. Well, I believe in being open with your people, but that's not a very good testimony to what Scripture expects of any mature Christian. What did Paul say? And of course, we look upon Paul as the great apostle, the saint. Follow me as I follow Christ. He said, you are living epistles. You're living epistles. You see how far we can get off from the Scripture when we use all these logical arguments which seem so great, and when we want to be so humble? And they have to be. There's no person that is more humble than somebody that has actually given his heart over to God and learns what it means to live in the love of God. You'll have enough to keep you humble. in yourself and in people around you. And so the simple fact is that Mr. Inskip took me off on this. The simple fact is that Inskip at first didn't like the movement. He used all of these arguments against it. But then, I always have to laugh at this because it happens so often. His dear wife went up to Sing Sing camp meeting. That's Sing Sing, New York, where the prison is. This is Sing Sing, for those of you that know that famous old name in prisons, like San Quentin. And she went up the river to Sing Sing, and there in that camp meeting, she heard about the shorter way, and she got sanctified. Well, brothers, watch out for yourselves when your wife gets sanctified. She came home, and John was not acting very sanctified sometimes. And she said, John, you need this blessing. He said, you don't know what it'll do for you. And she kept after him and after him and after him. And here this preacher who wrote Methodism Explained one morning got up and took a text and preached a holiness message, very similar to what was preached at Sing Sing. He heard his wife preach it so much, he knew it by heart. And got up and preached it, and the Lord got a hold of his heart and humbled him. And he said to his people, what? Not come to the altar. He said, come join your pastor at the altar. And he was sanctified holy, and the Methodist understanding of that experience, and as they preached it from the Bible, and the result was that John Inskip became the general of the Holiness Movement. Now notice, I'm using post-Civil War terms, and it's very appropriate. He became the general of the Holiness Movement, not the father. Of course, the father would be back in Wesley's time, and the mother in Phoebe Palmer. He became the general, because everything in those days was being preached to millions and millions of veterans who had been in camp and who had been under military authority. And so this generalship was the mantle put on him. And very quickly, he began to take a leadership position in holiness camp meetings and holiness revivals. He went to Phoebe Palmer's movement, and that must have been a humbling experience after he had more or less panned her and made, at least he rose questions. It wasn't a mean book. It was just a typical anti-holiness book which circulated even in Methodism in this time. And so he took the book and left it behind and entered into a new experience, dramatically and for his sake gloriously. The next morning he wrote in his diary, which he kept every day, journal, at the top of every day after that of his life, which is up until the 1880s, he said, I am, O Lord, holy and forever thine. His consecration statement. I am, O Lord. And that was the symbol or the motto by which he lived after that time. By the way, that was used at this old Methodist camp meeting, Ocean Grove, which I keep referring to because of my recent experience there. That was used as the theme of the camp meeting this year. And I stayed in John and Martha Inskip's house, which has been renovated and made to one of the nicest bed and breakfast inns in Ocean Grove, New Jersey, along the shore below Atlantic City, or above Atlantic City. So that's the beginning. Now, how did Inskip become the general? A group of people in Pennsylvania, right north of here, up in the Wyoming Valley, decided that there ought to be a camp meeting dedicated. Now, Methodists had many, many camp meetings, but they were going quite recreational. Ocean Grove's kind of half between. It was always quite spiritual, at the same time it was on the beach, so it was kind of a recreational place. But Methodist camp meetings began to become more recreational and informational, like Chautauqua, which we talked about at noon. But the holiness people decided they would have a camp meeting in which they wouldn't preach salvation, they would preach holiness. Now, by that, they didn't mean they wouldn't preach about being born again, but the emphasis would be on holiness. And do you know you can't preach holiness without getting people saved? There's no quicker way to get people into the life of salvation than to lay out what God has for us in His goodness as we become part of His plan. All of the great expansive ideas of Christianity are opened up by grace, by optimism of grace. And no matter who we are, we can't begin. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard, and hasn't entered into the heart of man what God has prepared for those that love Him. That's not heaven. That's on this earth. That's what God will do for you right now. And of course, it all hangs on whether or not we get into right relationship with Him. And so They said, it was again a woman who said to her pastor, J.A. Wood, who later became a great holiness preacher, said to J.A. Wood, we ought to have a camp meeting. And she was headed for New Jersey, where there were a lot of Methodist camp meetings, South Jersey. She said, we ought to have a camp meeting in which we emphasize Wesley's doctrine as part of the new revival. And she was thinking, of course, of the Phoebe Palmer movement, which we've just talked about. And he took it to some other ministerial brethren, and eventually they said, well, the fellow that's got to organize it is John Inskip, because he was kind of a dominant organizational personality in the movement. And so they went to Inskip, and he said, sure. And they went to other leaders, and finally they decided that they would hold a Methodist camp meeting in Vineland, New Jersey. And some of you from that area will know it. In Vineland, New Jersey, in the city park. And there they would spend 10 days preaching to people that they ought to find this second experience in Christian life. Second blessing, as it's commonly called. 20,000 people showed up. Now, this is 1867. And get that date, that's an important date. 2 years after the war ended, in 1867, in Vineland, New Jersey, 20,000 people showed up. Basically, that was possible because they had just put the railroad through. Many times, revivals are helped or hindered by what God has to work with. I don't want to get too far into this, but the simple fact is that the telegraph expanded the layman's revival by taking it across the ocean at the same time it was happening, and there's a certain vibrancy when somebody calls you up at night and said, man, we had 1,000 in service tonight. You begin to wonder, well, couldn't I have that too? And immediately you get all this spiritual energy going among people and hopefulness and perspective, and the result was evangelicals have always, as you well know, have always been used to using technology for the cause of God. First on television, the first on radio. I used to speak here on the radio station when I was just a kid for Brian Musselman, who started one of the earliest radio. He was a Mennonite, one of the earliest radio ministries in here, and the oldest station in Allentown. Way back in the 1920s, he was using the radio to preach to this area, just when radio was coming out of its earliest days. This has always been done by people who believe that evangelism and mission are the life of the church. Now, there again, we've got the bad side of it. We've got the picture of the money-grubbing television evangelist, and we've got the sad pictures of some of the falls. But the simple fact is, God's too smart for us. God's too smart for us. Not that there's any power in those things spiritually, but God uses our society. He uses our things that are happening. He uses current events. Look at Billy Graham. It's common knowledge that when Billy Graham was just a young Youth for Christ evangelist in Los Angeles, one of the most powerful people in the United States, the head of the newspaper chain, said, push Graham. And the result was that Graham's work was emblazoned across the top of the pages in L.A. and San Francisco and all across California, and from there across the United States. Now, you can look at that as you will, but the simple fact is only one person could get him to say, push Graham. Now, he thought he was doing it because it might make his papers some money, but God was doing it because he wanted Graham pushed. Amen. See? That's the way. Now, don't ask me to prove that, because I can't prove that, but I just know that that's the way God works. We see that from history. That's the way God works. And so it's no strange thing that many of the radio broadcasts, many of the television programs have been sponsored by entrepreneurs in the spiritual life who sometimes get into trouble because of that, because it's difficult and strange work. But the simple fact is, God uses that to do his work. Amen. As he will use anything else. If he could use a rod for Moses, he can use a television camera for somebody else. But we have to do it for God. So, Inskip said, we're going to have a camp meeting. You got 20,000 people out. They had a tremendous week. Bishop Simpson was there. Bishop Simpson is the one who preached Abraham Lincoln's funeral message. Abraham Lincoln was not a Methodist, but at the moment of his death, he was probably closest to the Methodist Church as far as any spiritual connection. And Bishop Simpson was the one who preached his funeral message in the great tragedy of his death. And Bishop Simpson was there. His son got saved at the camp meeting, and died within about a couple of months, I think. and Bishop Simpson always attributed his son's salvation to the great camp meeting which was held at Vineland. But the important thing about the Vineland camp meeting is that these Methodist ministers who organized it, against opposition, there were some people who weren't too happy that this was being promoted. And the result was that they got together after the camp meeting, and on their knees, this is very significant, on their knees, they believed under spiritual leadership, they organized an association. It's very interesting, they did it on their knees. They make a lot of this. In prayer, they felt God led them to organize the National Camp Meeting Association for the Promotion of Holiness. The National Camp Meeting Association for the Promotion of Holiness. That was the first name of the NHA, as we commonly know it, or now the CPA. I'll get through those changes. And so, let me tell you what this is now. This is the group that led the revival on through the latter part of the 19th century. They were Methodist pastors. Nobody else could join. There's a group of Methodist pastors. They took their vacation time in the summer to hold camp meetings. You see the intentionality here. The promotion, remember my word promotion? They knew that there wouldn't be a revival unless they got busy as well as God getting busy. We don't have revivals because we're sitting around waiting for something. Nor can we bring them on because we're busy. But God and we have to get together, and that's where prayer comes in, so that God is able to do what He always wants to do, and that's bring us new life. And so they got on their knees, and they believed that God led them to form this association in which they would give their vacation every year to setting up similar camp meetings and having national camp meetings. Remember, this is post-Civil War. The war was fought over the Union and over slavery, both of those issues. But the national camp meeting to re-heal the nation and to get the nation on the right foot as it started out again after the Civil War. There's a lot of societal implications here and cultural implications, and to revive the church, and especially Methodism. And so Inskip became the president of the National Camp Meeting Association National Camp Meeting Association for the Promotion of Christian Holiness. I'm trying to get that first name. It was shortened, as you can see why. It would be. It was shortened later on to the National Holiness Association, and many people today still remember that name. Led by Methodist ministers until the 1940s, when one of our Pilgrim Holiness ministers, I believe, was the first non-Methodist to hold presidency of that association. That association continues today. It is now whatever 1867 to 2000 is. It's 133 years old. It's the oldest evangelistic association in the United States in continuity in history. It was a pioneer of this kind of para-church association. Although everybody in the association was Methodist, nevertheless, it was looked upon as something extra. Para means something outside of the regular organized church. And it was done to start and promote a holiness revival. We are here today basically because of what those men did there, together with a host of other things. But without this, we would have none of the present American picture of denominations as we have it, or American evangelical life, or any of that. We are here because those men felt on their knees that they should keep on promoting the Wesleyan doctrine of Christian perfection. And so, every year after that, until now, somewhere in the United States, but many times in that case, national holiness camp meetings were held in which the main preaching was on entering into the perfect life. Didn't deny, never rejected regeneration and justification. They're part of the whole plan of God. But telling Christians, these were camp meetings for Christians, but many times hundreds of people were saved, as well as being sanctified. Now, the result was that holiness began to revive again within the Methodist Church. It began to have its effects. But I want you to notice that there's some things that developed because of the change in the movement. It was easy for some non-Methodists to sit in Phoebe Palmer's meeting or to get her paper, the Guide to Holiness. It wasn't a Methodist paper, it was a movement paper. It was easy for them to kind of work with that, if they were Baptists or if they were Presbyterians. But when you get a group of Methodist ministers, the Methodist ministers were quite powerful people in those days. Methodism was run by its ministers rather strongly. There wasn't a big lay representation. When you get a group of Methodist ministers who are pushing something within the church and who are basically committed to keeping it Methodist, which they were. This was not a separatist movement. They wanted to keep it in the church and revive the church. And so when you get that, then you've got a different dynamic. Now you get more polemical. Now you've got one up against the other, like a Presbyterian saying, well, that's Methodist. See, before they could say that woman Phoebe Palmer, but now they said that's Methodist. And many Methodists said, well, don't you get too involved in this. And they didn't say it on purpose, but this is what happened. They said, you're not Methodist. If you want to become Methodist, you can be part of it. Do you understand the dynamics that begin working? Altogether different from a parlor conversation. And now even in Methodism, because Methodism is changing and you're into a new era, you're into the new post-war era, and new theologies are coming in, and Darwin is writing his books about evolution, and the new psychology books are coming into being, and the whole world is changing its mind about what it's all about in the secular, liberal development of books and teaching and training of professors and all of that kind of thing in Germany, with all of the German theologies about the Bible, questions about biblical authenticity and all that. These are all beginning to feed into society. And the result is that they begin to feed into the church. In 1895, almost every theological position in Methodism changed from the old generation to the new, except for one or two. And most of the new professors were trained not in Wesleyan theology, but in what? In German theology. And German theology was the theology of higher criticism, which we talk about, biblical criticism, higher criticism particularly, which questioned the historicity of Christ, and the historicity, like Strauss, and the historicity of the Bible, and whether or not it was accurate. And on down the line, all the various names which some of you have come across in your studies, I'm sure, Schleiermacher and on down to Nietzsche and all the German philosophers. All of this began to flood into Methodist theological seminaries. And after a while, Wesley was forgotten about. In fact, he wasn't only forgotten, he was rejected. And so when the Holiness Movement kept saying, we are Wesleyan, it became a double negative. In the first place, some people said, well, Phoebe Palmer's theology is not Wesleyan. Not only were they questioning Phoebe Palmer's theology, they were also rejecting Wesleyan theology as a whole. They were thinking Wesley was out of date. And so the movement faced these two criticisms. Now, in addition to that, the movement also was faced by the fact that Methodism was growing at the rate of a church a day. They were building a new Methodist church every day in the 1880s, 1890s under Bishop McCabe. You ever heard of McCabe? They were building a church every day. He was kind of the head of home missions, as we used to call it, church extension. Now, what happens when you get 1,000 ministers every couple of years who are new in the church? You lose your memory, unless they happen to come out of a very different Methodist church in which that was kept up. But you had to supply these churches. Any district superintendent knows today, even in our tradition, that one of the most difficult things is to get qualified pastors who have any idea about what the church is all about. And so the result was, I want to make a statement here to be fair to everybody. I think Methodism lost its holiness teaching as a major part of its understanding for so long, not because it fought against it, even though some did, but because it simply lost it. I think it simply lost it because these new men came in, new people came into the churches, they didn't have any teaching, they didn't know what Wesley said. In fact, most of them were not interested in hearing what Wesley said, and the result was that the church gradually lost its memory, except for the holiness element, which has always been in the church and is still in the church today, in the Methodist Church. Well, that was over a period of time. That was in this post-Civil War period. I'm trying to build, here come the theologies. They had their effect on the seminaries, and Wesley was left behind. Here come the normal opponents who say, you're not saved in any moment. They even defied Wesley at that point. They said, you're saved by a gradual process only. Now I'm back to my point. I'm back there again. The simple fact is, Wesley too believed that you were saved, that you're sanctified gradually. But in that gradual process, from sin to maturity in Christ, there are two great crises that have to happen. One of them is regeneration and justification. We have to be made right with God. We have to be born again. Wesley was very clear on that. And the second one was, we have to come to the point where we cease rebelling against God and let Him know so and ask Him to sanctify our hearts, free us from the old nature so that we are free to love Him rather than natural to hate Him. You follow that? We have an inclination in us, like a son to a father whom he loves. We want to do His will. Our first reaction is not, oh God, not that again. Or struggling with something in which God and ourselves are always on the double-minded man, the man who, as James talks about. And so the simple fact is that is where God wants to bring us, and that was being lost in the church. And finally, of course, the church was becoming wealthy. One of Wesley's main warnings before he died in his own church, in his lifetime, of course, he lived a long time, and so he saw the church develop. One of Wesley's main warnings was, if Methodists become wealthy, they're going to be in great danger. Wealthy and powerful. And do you know what happened? And I don't have the answer to this. It's something we just have to meet in trying to keep up the spiritual life of the church. When they began to get the lawyers in town, and I won't make any jokes there in America, we got a lot of jokes about the lawyers. I have to put one in. There are too many that are good. One of the best, I think, is a very simple one. If all the lawyers in America were laid end to end, it would be a good thing. Well, so much for that American pastime. My lawyer friends have given me some of the best jokes I have, and if you think I'm prejudiced against them particularly. But nevertheless, the simple fact is, when you get the lawyers in the community, remember, Methodism became the American church. It was the biggest and the most influential church in the 19th century. The 19th century is called, in American church history, the Methodist century. What's the contemporary century which we just passed? What's that called? Oh, come on. The Baptist century. Okay, I can't take that a lot further, but you can see the implications there. The 19th century was called the Methodist century, in which Methodism had the major imprint upon how, especially evangelical Christianity existed, and it was all evangelical at that time. This century is commonly called the Baptistic century, which shows the influence of that side of evangelicalism upon all of our lives, our religious thinking, and so forth. And that's what you struggle with when you get the Southern Baptists rejecting women ministers and that kind of thing. And the people say, well, what's wrong with us? They're good evangelicals. Why do we have women ministers? And that kind of thing. So that's the Baptistic century, which is part of our culture at this point. So Wesleyanism and Methodism got all of these influential people into its churches. Wesley never had the strict entrance into societies, the requirements that we do in an evangelical church. He said, anybody who is searching after God can be a part of my society. And then he had the inner circle, which was called the Holiness Band, in which he had the people who were seeking for Christian perfection, and they were kind of the heart of his society. Now that's because he was not a church. He was in the Anglican Church as a society. But in America, we don't do churches that way. In America, we demand a testimony. Most evangelical churches will demand that we testify to being born again at the minimum in order to become part of the church. And in our church, born again and the intent to go on to holiness. That's our basic requirement. And so more and more, the membership requirements of the church were let down. The societies, which had met regularly, or they had to have the tickets to meet together, These societies were canceled. After the war, there were practically no class meetings required in Methodism. That was all dropped because why? It took too much time, and it was too much discipline, and other things came along, and we got more busy, and even more busy today. I'm just saying that we are all affected in our religious life and the religious life of the nation by contemporary events and what's happening in many different places, in many different ways, and the result is that we lose something or we gain something. We have a revival or we have a backsliding as a culture, one or the other. And so in Methodism and the larger churches in general, the American Baptist Church, which was the old Baptist Church before the Southern Baptist, and the Episcopal Church, and all of these churches were encompassed by this kind of atmosphere of what we commonly now call liberalism, in which the Bible was played down and the human situation was played up, which ended, of course, with the First World War and was killed definitely by the Second World War, and is now not a major force in the life of the nation or in religion, but certainly not, it will always be there as an alternative for many people who believe that that's the way we ought to go. But liberalism was developed, and the result was that Methodism lost Wesley somewhere in the mix. They lost his theology, and the result was that the mantle for keeping Wesley alive basically fell to the new holiness churches. And we're going to discuss how those churches came into being. Now, back to the camp meetings. Skip and his group became so successful in their promotion through camp meetings. Many bishops were part of it. But the camp meeting has never been an official part of Methodism. There's no discipline allowing for camp meetings in Methodism, but Methodism has always used the camp meeting. But you see, when you get to a place then, now follow me, where a camp meeting movement becomes a threat in many ways, or a disruption, whatever they may have called it, or becomes anti-Methodist, or is not Methodist, or is not Wesleyan, whatever, when it becomes that, since it was not an official organ of the church, it was easier to deal with it disciplinary-wise, because it was never an approved institution. And so at the height of the Holiness Revival, which is about 1877, 78, when Methodism was most affected by the work of Phoebe Palmer and these men, now, by the way, 40 years old, the movement. Remember, this movement started in 1830, 35, and it went on until the churches separated in 1895, 1900, when the major holiness bodies broke away, and some people never did separate. It's the longest that any revival movement of this intensity and parachurch movement has stayed within a denomination. That's something that's often forgotten. Almost 70 years, there was a definite relationship between this revival movement and the official Methodist body. And in a sense, that's never ceased completely. So they were very successful. But, and here's the point we want to turn to now, it spread worldwide and it spread beyond Methodism. Now I want you to see a situation. Here we have a group of Methodist ministers preaching a Methodist doctrine and promoting it, mainly to recoup the doctrine in Methodism, mainly to bring it back and revive it. But all of a sudden, Baptists are believing it, and Congregationalists are believing it, Episcopalians are believing it, and Presbyterians are preaching it. Are they supposed to join the Methodist Church? So what you develop ultimately, within the holiness movement, you develop two groups of people. Those who are willing to be Methodist, because this is a Methodist doctrine, or to adopt Methodist doctrines, and those who say, well, look, I've got no connection with the Methodist Church. I like this biblical doctrine, and it's Wesleyan, of course, but it's biblical. I'm not going to join a Methodist church, and by this time, many of the Methodist churches were getting more liberal than many of the evangelical people enjoyed at the time, and the result was you get a whole other movement, which is an independent holiness movement that is outside of Methodism completely, but is still largely dominated by this group of Methodist ministers. Now, you don't know where we're going, but simply where we're going to the fact is that our churches developed out of that kind of atmosphere. Some of the holiness churches are made up of people who were converted in these great camp meetings, but who weren't Methodist. And so they are people who adopted the Methodist doctrine, but they never became Methodists, as far as the total complex of what it means to be a Methodist. On the other hand, there was a whole group of people who were determined that they were not going to become separatists, because to be separatists would be to take them out of Methodism, and they had vowed that they would stay in Methodism. So you've got a conflict which develops in the holiness revival in America, in which some people want to be holiness, but they don't want to be Methodist, and other people insist that to be holiness they have to be Methodist because they don't want to be a divisive movement. And the result is tragedy for the first wave of conversions. What happened was, thousands and thousands of people were sanctified and converted by the first holiness evangelists in these great meetings. But they didn't do any follow-up because they didn't want to seem to be divisive in the Methodist Church. So they didn't organize anything for these people. They said, come on over and be a Methodist. Well, a lot of these people didn't want to be Methodist. They wanted to be Christian, but they didn't want to be Methodist. And so, as a result, they were left shepherdless. And thousands of people were won to Christ and lost to Christ because the movement was not able somehow to figure out that enigma. How they could take care of these people and not seem like they were starting another church. And the big word, of course, was come-outers. That was the word the denominations used against all of these people and against all of us as holiness people at some point or other. That come-outers. In other words, people that are dissatisfied and split the church over their doctrines. And this is why, by the time we get toward the end of the century, when these people are dead and other leaders are in, not quite as dynamic, this is why more and more the independent holiness movement becomes influential in getting the converts, and the Methodist movement tends to withdraw back into Methodism and become part of a tradition which is Asbury, and that is, we're going to stay in the church, we're going to do our work in the church, and if it means we pull back a little bit, we're going to say Methodism. That's basically what they confessed. And the result was that the movement kind of split. And out of the other movement came a lot of our churches, which are holiness churches today. The Pilgrim Holiness Church particularly came out of the more radical element. The Church of God Anderson is the church with the largest number of non-Methodists when it was founded. It had all kinds of people in it, the Church of God Anderson. So this is the National Holiness Camp Meeting Association. It got into terrible conflict with Methodist officials finally, and finally Methodism decided about 1890-94 that they were going to bring it under control. And so in Southern Methodism they passed a law that papers could not be published by the Holiness Association, that meetings should not be held, and kind of squeezed it out of the church. So holiness people are people who both were forced out of Methodism, and people who didn't join Methodism, and people who left Methodism, and other churches, and other established churches which did the same thing, but with more reason because they were not Methodist in the first place. The Presbyterians and Congregationalists, they put a lot of people out. And so that's the mix now, which we're going to take up in the next section as to where our churches come from. But I want to take one thing further if we have time here. The churches were greatly affected. Existing churches were greatly affected, and I want to get this in. Many Quakers became Wesleyans. Many Quakers became Wesleyans. And the result is that we have a Wesleyan Quaker church. Many brethren in Christ became Wesleyans. Eisenhower's great-grandfather was a holiness person, or grandmother, whichever. The River Brethren up north on the Susquehanna River in Pennsylvania up here. Many Mennonites became Wesleyan. And several of those traditions, and the missionary church came out of a similar background. All of these are churches that became influenced and became essentially Wesleyan churches, keeping their other traditions intact and kind of tacking Wesleyanism onto it. And so Messiah College, which was the college of the Brethren in Christ Church, and colleges on the West Coast, which were Brethren in Christ, all of those are part of the Holiness tradition. Quaker colleges out in the West Coast, all were part of the Holiness tradition. One more group, and this I think I can conclude on the video. Christian Missionary Alliance was a Holiness church. A.B. Simpson, its founder, is some of the clearest teaching on holiness, almost exactly what Wesley preached. The Christian Missionary Alliance gave the Holiness Church, the Pilgrim Holiness Church, much of its doctrinal formation, the fourfold gospel, which was salvation, sanctification, premillennial return of Christ, and healing. The fourfold, that was on the top of every advocate in the Pilgrim Holiness Church, the fourfold gospel. The same thing that the Christian Missionary Alliance Church has. The Christian Missionary Alliance Church today, by the way, in many areas, especially in their more formal areas, the Christian Alliance Church is not happy about being part of the Holiness Movement because they are heavily affected by the fact that half of their people were not Methodist, they were Presbyterian, and the baptistification of the last century has tended to pull them over into a general evangelical thing in which they do not wish to be identified as holiness, but they are sprung body and soul right out of the Holiness tradition. And that's what formed their church. Both Seth Cook Reese and Martin Wells Knapp, who founded the Pilgrim Holiness Church, were members of the Christian and Missionary Alliance before it became a denomination, when it was an evangelistic association. Heavily influenced by it. But now they tend to separate themselves. When we start the next tape, I'm going to give you an idea of where the Holiness churches fit in the whole picture of American church history and where the tradition is, and then we're going to go in eventually into the history of the Pilgrim Holiness Church, the history of the Wesleyan Methodist Church and some of the issues, and then come up to merger, and then we're going to save at least one tape for issues: Pentecostalism, healing, all the things which are part of name it, claim it, or whatever else we want to name.